قاتلوا الذين لا يؤمنون بالله ولا باليوم الآخر ولا يحرمون ما حرم الله ورسوله ولا يدينون بدين الحق من الذين أوتوا الكتاب حتى يعطوا الجزية عن يد وهم صاغرون. So right after that, what do we need to do to protect this sacred space? What do we need to do? Allah showed us that when you took things for granted, Hunayn didn't go your way. And had it but for God coming to support His Prophet, it could have been a disaster. Now, this is declared a sacred exclusive space. Allah could have simply said, fight the unbelievers until they give you the jizya. And indeed, commentators to the Quran have sort of pondered, why does Allah say, fight to those who do not believe in God or the final day, وَلَا يُحَرِّمُونَ مَا حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ, and they do not forbid what God has forbidden. وَلَا يَدِينُونَ دِينَ الْحَقِّ, and they don't follow the true religion. مِنَ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابِ, from those, or amongst those, amongst people of the book. So some commentators said, well, what God is talking about is saying, well, Jews and Christians, for instance, allow pork and alcohol, and that's وَلَا يُحَرِّمُونَ مَا حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ, that they don't forbid what God forbids, meaning they don't forbid consumption of pork or alcohol. But that's sort of cheating the meaning of the text, because if you would have said, fight people of the book, it would have conveyed the same meaning. In my view, as we'll see in a second, the practice of the Prophet ﷺ was indeed not to fight all the people of the book, and as we will talk about it in a second, and in fact didn't even take the jizya from all people of the book. But it is Allah knew, and this is in my opinion, in my view, Allah knew that paganism was going to become history in Arabia. Not even that long after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, paganism becomes extinct. In fact, tribes like Banu Taghlib in Arabia, which was a major pagan tribe, didn't want to convert to Islam. It converted to Christianity. The trend was obvious that paganism has become outdated, unconvincing. The infrastructure that allowed paganism to be lucrative for the elite of Arabia has crashed, has crumbled. But in order for Muslims to be able to secure their sacred spaces among people of the book, the way I understand وَلَا يُحَرِّمُونَ مَا حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ is they are not committed to the same ethics of virtue that you are committed to. And therefore, they exist hostile to you. They will seek to take what you have. And we'll see this in Surah At-Tawbah when Allah starts talking about sort of dissecting the who are the people that Muslims must be worried about. SubhanAllah, Surah At-Tawbah speaks across the ages. And it is the whole, when we look at the whole institution of jizya. So first, this is the poll tax that, and we've talked plenty about the institution of the poll tax before Islam, and that it was a regular part of conducting international law. The function of a poll tax in international law before Islam was to, as a sign of who who acknowledges, not allegiance, but who acknowledges the power of the other. If powers are, if two powers are equal to one another, then they refuse to pay jizya to one another. The Sassanid Empire never agreed to pay jizya to Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantine Empire never agreed to pay a jizya to the Sassanid Empire. Why? Because they saw themselves as equally pitted. War broke out between the Sassanids and the Byzantines when an emperor would come and would make a demand. So a Byzantine emperor would take power and would approach the Sassanids and say, I expect from now on a delivery of X amount of gold. Either that or war. This is, and of course, this demand, every time was made, it was rejected, and so war would break out. If one wanted to avoid an ongoing state of war, the options are you approach the other with a treaty of non belligerence, so I will not pay you, you will not pay me, but we will put war aside. And these treaties were always had an expiration date. And unlike treaties today, which normally most treaties today expire upon 99 years, that's the common practice. Even the UN Charter expires in 99 years. Um, that's according to the UN Charter itself. Just people don't read the they don't bother reading the actual treaty. People think that it's indefinite. It's not indefinite. It's 99 years. Uh, Back then, a big part of what you negotiate is you're looking at your expectation of how long can your enemy or can the other maintain their strength and thus maintain their ability to exist co-equal to you, not paying an amount that demonstrates subservience. So, for instance, if you see an emperor and you estimate this emperor is old and might die in 5 years, then you would negotiate a treaty for 5 years. And you'd say, well, I'm betting on the fact that when their emperor dies, they're going to go through a period of instability and then they might be forced to renegotiate their circumstances and so on and so forth. Here is a very significant innovation that Islam introduced. And again, because Muslims don't write their own history and are a colonized people who don't know anything about anything, it goes without. The Quran says, look, حتى يعطوا الجزية عن يد وهم صاغرون, until they pay what Muhammad Asad translated exemption tax or poll tax, jizya. عن يد, he translated as a willing hand, which I'll comment on that in 1 second. After having been humbled. This is Muhammad Asad's translation. Okay. So, first, there is a discussion in the classical sources about what an yad means. An yad is an idiomatic expression. Although you find a range of views, but the view that had the greatest influence upon Islamic law and the correct view, in my opinion, an yad means an طيب نفس or an انقياد دون إكراه. That an yad, it means that willingly they pay the jizya. An yad means willingly. If there is coercion, then there is no an yad. وهم صاغرون, meaning, although modern Muslims often think that it means that they are humiliated or degraded, وهم صغيرون, and they are inferior in power to you. Compared to you, you as Muslims must be stronger than them. If you fail to be stronger, you violated God's command already. If you accept for yourself a state of inferiority and weakness, if you understand anything about the Quran, you've already compromised. Now, what is the importance on the way that what's the importance of the way that Muslims understood an yad willingly, and what is the innovation? Muslim jurists, when they looked at the practice of the Prophet ﷺ, people like Al-Awza'i, Imam Al-Awza'i, the Syrian, and most Malikis, and some Hanafis, said that the jizya can be accepted from anyone and not necessarily just people of the book. Why do we think that Muslims say only people of the book? That's thanks to Orientalist scholarship. Because Khadduri wrote in his book that Muslims only accept from Christians and Jews. And Khadduri had his own deal. Khadduri was a Christian, was Christian convictions, was his own program and his own, and he was an Orientalist in every sense of the word. But we forget that that it is only Shafi'is and Hanbalis and later Hanafis who say that the jizya can be limited to Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians and Sabians. So even them, they still say Zoroastrians and Sabians. But the Syrian school of Awza'i, and the Maliki school, the whole school of Medina and onwards, said it is to be taken from anyone. But the understanding of an yad, that it must be done willingly, was the entry point to a revolutionary understanding of the institution of paying the poll tax. That it is not just money that you collect as a signal of your superiority to the other, but that it is money that you collect as a price for protection. That was unprecedented in international practice in the Near East. When Muslim jurists like Awza'i started saying that if you are unable to protect a group, then even if they are inferior to you in power, while according to the customary practice of the Near East, you could collect the jizya, but according to Sharia, you cannot collect the jizya. The Umayyads had such a huge, well, the Umayyads and the Abbasids later as well, such a huge difficulty with this. Because the fuqaha were telling them, if you cannot protect, you must return the jizya. But if you are relying on the customary practices of the Near Eastern region, no one thought the poll tax is protection money. It is subservience money. This was a radical alteration. I mean, it's amazing that all the books I've read on international law, written in English by Muslims, not a single scholar have pointed this very obvious point. All you need to do is study the legal systems of the Near East, of the Near East at the time, and you will see how radical, and especially that Muslims actually practiced it. Not always, not consistently. Nothing is ever consistent in historical practice. But there were plenty of times where Muslims, in fact, said, we can't protect you, so we can't collect the jizya. This is no small deal, people. All studies of international law start with Suarez, Pfuffendorf, and Vattel, and Grotius in the 17th century onwards. But the civilizing ideas that influenced the Venetian school and the Italian school of international law, where did it come from? It came from the Islamic influence. The idea that international law is not just about brute power, but there are principles. It's really sad. It's really sad because it's just the way. I mean, how many times I've listened to these people who are very proud of themselves, ex-Muslims or former Muslims, whatever, and in every ad nauseum, every time, this is one of the verses that they'll point to as verses of shame and embarrassment, and I laugh. Yani, of course, I don't mean to laugh, but I laugh out of sadness, out of at the level of ignorance. Because if these people had any level of education, but it's not their fault. How are they going to get educated if the Muslims are not educating them? And Muslims are happy with their scholars who wear turbans and look like they belong to you know 10 centuries ago, but their brains are empty because they never read any real scholarship. Who's going to educate them? And if they understood what this little verse triggered and the revolution it caused in international law, and if they understood that when Banu Taghlib, for instance, who were pagan, and Banu Taghlib chose to convert not to Islam but to Christianity, when they saw that paganism is khalas, it's backwards, it's not in fashion anymore. So, but they didn't want to be Muslims, and then Banu Taghlib, go read books of Sirah. Banu Taghlib, when they sent representatives to the Prophet ﷺ and said, it is degrading for us to pay the jizya. So the Prophet ﷺ told them, okay, you will not pay a jizya, you will pay a sadaqah. And until Banu Taghlib converted centuries later to Islam, what they paid to Muslims was a sadaqah. But what's very interesting is that when Umar comes to power, he tells them, okay, we collect a sadaqah from you. That means I will treat you as part of our relationship with you is not a relationship of we protect you. If your fortunes go up and down with the economics of Islam. So if we have money to help your poor, we will help your poor. You are part of us. But of course, they were not required to because non-Muslims didn't contribute to the military. But they had a special relationship. The other thing that is also astounding is that I've read tons of ancient medieval agreements of payments. The as I said, it was so common. Look, when Andalus, in its waning days, every Muslim Imara in Andalus paid a jizya to the Christian states. And the reason that Andalus eventually was defeated is that the Christian states kept raising the jizya that the Muslims had to pay until they would get to a point where they can't afford it, and then they would be invaded. I mean, again, the amazing thing in Islamic sources is that they say the jizya has to be pursuant to aqd zimma. It has to be pursuant to be a contract, and zimma means a contract of protection. And they explicitly say, and I've traced this in numerous, إذا احتيج للإكراه والتجبر فلا يبقى عقد ذمة. That the condition of this contract is that it is not entered into through coercion. And if it is coercively entered into, then by definition it cannot be aqd zimma. It cannot be a contract of protection. The idea that coercion cannot be used in international affairs was another radical Muslim innovation. No one thought until the Muslim age No one thought that coercion is somehow would negate it could in Roman law coercion could negate a contract, but not a treaty. Not a treaty. Because people understood international affairs or the law of nations or the law of political entities as necessarily coercive. It is a natural thing for it to be coercive. The stronger coerces the weaker. Muslims came along and introduced for the first time, even Suarez and Grotius and Pfuffendorf in the 7th century couldn't reach that. They thought that's too radical. That is why they allowed the colonizing of indigenous populations, because they could not get themselves to say that contracts that were entered into coercively with indigenous populations are void. They thought that, so that is even one part, even in the 17th century, that the imagine if Muslims understood these realities about their tradition. Again, I go back because I've told myself that it's not good for my health anymore to listen to these ex-Muslims, because it's so ignorant. But again, I'm just full of anger. I don't know who to be angry. I'm not angry at them because they're ignorant, but I can't blame them for their ignorance because obviously they've never met a teacher worth their salt in their life. But who do you get upset at? I mean, when you reach that level of of utter abysmal standards in just the knowledge of your own history. Okay, and of course, you can لا يحل تكليف الذم أهل الذمة ما لا يطاق ولا يحل تعذيبهم ولا ضربهم or ضربهم. All of this material about that you can't the how much the jizya has to be, that it cannot be what they cannot afford, that it cannot be you cannot assess a jizya on old people or women or children or people of religion, priests and rabbis and so on. That it cannot be an oppressive amount. You can't beat them. You can't torture them. You can't imprison them. All of these were radical innovations by Islam. Because again, I spent a lifetime now reading about medieval state of conduct or conduct of state, medieval practices, and to see if there were any precedent to the idea that you can't imprison the others, followers of another religion, if they fail to pay you. And the people who invented that concept were Muslims. Okay, let's take a. Oh, is it Maghrib? Should we pray Maghrib? Okay, let's pray Maghrib and then we'll come back. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maybe to summarize this material, because Surah At-Tawbah is the surah has the verse that is usually pointed to as having the issue of jizya. Um, that this in no legal system speaks with one voice, and no historical reality speaks in one trajectory. What is interesting here are the ideals that sprout, that represented advancements to human thinking. And in this context, to just summarize what we've talked about, that first, and I'm not going to do it in order because I can't remember the order, but عن يد means عن طيب نفس or عن طيب خاطر, that duna ikrah, that the payment of the jizya must be consensual, not coercive, and that was an innovation. Now, was that actually practiced in the history of imperial Islam? It went up and down. You can't generalize. Quite often, it was not practiced because, regardless of what the ideals are, human beings, especially political leaders that govern over empires, their practice is guided by often not by religious ideals, but nevertheless, religious ideals remain there to as a moral way to hold realpolitik to account, to take political decisions to task. So one is the idea of non-coercion, as we've said. Second is that the aqd dhimma, which was a radical idea, is that it is a contract to protect, not a contract of subservience, but a contract of protection. If you are unable to protect, then according to the ideals of the law, you are not entitled to collect the jizya. But furthermore, even within the ideals of the earliest jurists and the earliest authorities, basing themselves on the practice of the Prophet ﷺ, is that when groups objected to the payment of jizya because they thought it is demeaning or degrading, there was no obstacle to changing the obligation from a jizya to a sadaqah. So it is not a dogmatic point. Moreover, it is well established that the jizya is collected, assessed only upon male figures of active age. So children are excluded, elders are excluded, the religious class is excluded, women are excluded, and it is debated whether things like farmers and peasants are excluded or not. It is also well established that the jizya cannot be an oppressive amount. It cannot be an amount that causes hardship. And that in collecting the jizya, you cannot resort to measures such as beating or imprisoning. And the example that was often given in books of law, you can't punish people by having them stand out in the sun, because that was a very common practice that the Byzantines followed among Arab tribes when they collected the poll tax from them, is that those who failed to pay the poll tax would be forced to stand out in the sun for days until they collapsed. And Muslim jurists were very specific about saying that that's torture and that's not allowed. Now, I emphasize, these are ideals. The nature of legal practice is that people react to situations sometimes by betraying their ideals. So you can find texts, especially texts that were written during the Crusades, when Muslim lands were invaded by Crusades. And remember that there were as many as 14 different Crusades, 14 different invasions of what the heartland of the Near East, the heartland of the Middle East, which this is the indigenous lands of Muslims. It is not surprising to find a jurist writing a treatise that is full of vehemence against the invaders, and so is extremely hostile to Christians, or it was Christians. I mean, Jews actually. It's very rare to find a text that was hostile to Jews until Zionism and Palestine. Actually, Jews were until recently were often seen as natural allies to Muslims. Again, in response to the Crusades, because the Crusades butchered Muslims and Jews together. So when you find that, these people are butchered alongside of you, it's hard to cast them as the other. They're cast as part of who you are. So it is not surprising that you find texts, but what what's always surprising is the moral innovation to an established practice. So to talk of non-coercion, to talk of not using torture, to talk of not using imprisonment, to talk about that it is a contract of protection, these were the innovations. These were the unusual developments. Whether Muslims in fact were able to live up to their own ideals or not, that's a different matter. I mean, and that's a complicated matter because sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. Now, having said all of this, I believe, well, first, note that fight as the ayah that fight those who do not believe in God, etc., etc. The tendency of some Muslim scholars to see this ayah as abrogating every other ayah that deals with the non-Muslim other is ridiculous. As some have said that, Ayat al-Sayf abrogated 133 ayahs. It's ridiculous. This ayah must be understood in light of what everything else the Quran says. So when the Quran says, لا تعتدوا إن الله لا يحب المعتدين, that don't be aggressors, that Allah doesn't forbid you from peacefully coexisting with those who don't take your lands and don't kick you out of your homes. The command to fight must be understood in the context of everything else the Quran says about the other, including don't commit aggression. Now, furthermore, the context of this ayah is very clear that coming right after the sacred space has been declared as an exclusive Muslim spatial reality, the qital here, taken in context of the entire Quranic message, is that so you are able to protect your sacred spaces. I mean, look at Muslim history. We've lost Mecca and Medina. We have no autonomy over Mecca and Medina. It is not, if you think Muslims can decide what happens to Mecca and Medina, remember when the Haram was taken over by Jamaat Juhayna or whatever, Juhaymiyin or whatever they were called, it was French paratroopers who came in and stormed the Holy Haram and killed these fellows. It was French paratroopers, not Muslim forces. There is no Muslim sovereign on the face of the earth has any authority over what happens in Mecca and Medina. It is only Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is entirely subservient to the former colonial powers of the world, or the existing colonial powers of the world. The U.S., as Trump said, to king, you must pay because we protect you. Trump is collecting Jizya, protection money, in the old Byzantine meaning of Jizya, not in the Islamic meaning of Jizya, but as a sign of your subservience, as a sign of and our dominance, which of course includes the dominance of Israel and everything else Western. Anyway, so the message is clear that وَهُمْ صَاغِرُونَ, meaning, and they are weaker than you. You are under an affirmative obligation to be stronger. And stronger so you can be in a position to actually offer a contract of protection. It is not a contract of dominance. If you are not stronger, you can protect no one else, leave alone yourself. This, having said all of that, it is critical when you look at the actual seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. The reason that you are entering in a contract of dhimma, a contract of protection, is because you are protecting the other. There is a choice here. You either remain the other, meaning outsiders, and there is a contract, you pay us and we protect you, which of course implies the freedom to say we don't want to pay you and we don't want your protection, but you remain the other. But if you are like Banu Taghlib, and other tribes later on that choose to be one and the same with Muslims. The Prophet ﷺ didn't collect the jizya from the Jewish tribes in Medina. In Saqifat al-Medina, the constitution of Medina, the agreement was we help one another as the same people. And what that means is in the modern age, the reason that you don't collect jizya from Christians and Jews in your country, or Hindus or Buddhists or whatever, is in the modern nation state they are not the other. They are part of who you are. They are like the Banu Taghlib. You, they are not a separate entity. There is no such thing as someone dominating them but not you, or dominating you but not them. The very logic that upon which this was founded was the logic of the conduct of nations at the time, in which empires, dynasties, political entities defined boundaries, territorial boundaries were endlessly flexible and malleable. And you could say, well, today my boundaries includes this clan, tomorrow this clan doesn't want to be a part of me, so my boundary excludes this clan. This clan is on its own. If we go back to a world like that, then it's something else. But in today's world, where you have this massive international treaty called the United Nations Treaty and the United Nations Charter, and you have signatories to that charter in which everyone agrees that there are stable, constant boundaries, and that boundaries must be protected, and that you cannot transgress upon the territorial boundaries of another nation. That is, by definition, a world wedded by a musalaha, an ahd, a world established upon a system of treaty. If there is, and not that I would advise it, because if there exists a modern state that comes and says, we don't want to be a part of the United Nations, and we don't want to sign onto the UN Charter, and we don't recognize anyone's borders, of course that means that no one will recognize your borders, and which also means that then anyone can invade you, which also means that you will be at war with the world, exactly like the Daesh people. Anyone can strike against you, because you can strike against anyone. And you then will become obliterated from the face of the earth very quickly. Once you enter into the charter system, you have entered into a world of muwada'a and musalaha, in which, by definitions, defining the insider as opposed to the outsider does away with the whole protection money idea. So this is very clear, so that no one can, come and say, oh well, he's defending there's a difference between saying Muslims introduced moral, innovative, humanistic ideas to international practice, often ideas that they were not in a position to sponsor and chaperone into full fruition. But it behooves us to go back and to study the way that Islam was always at the cutting edge of virtue and morality. And that's what we should seek and aspire to reproduce. You're not on the cutting edge if you force time to turn backwards. You're not on the cutting edge if you just enter into a time machine and go back and change the rules of the game. That's laziness. That's just because you're not very intelligent and not very knowledgeable, and so you want to pretend that the world is, hasn't happened, that time hasn't changed, that people's consciousness haven't moved on. It behooves us to take things as they are and to rise up to the moral challenge. That's the point.